with a model like this one. Okay? So that could be an assessment, very different from that piece of paper with the multiple choice questions. All right, formative assessment and summative assessment. I was really interested to hear earlier this week that in Hong Kong, the Bureau of Education is making a great emphasis on assessments for learning. And that's the formative assessment idea. So when I use the term formative assessment, it's the same in Hong Kong. You talk about assessments for learning. And the idea is that this assessment occurs during the course of instruction before it's over. And the purpose of doing the assessment is in order to get information that can improve the instruction or the learning activity that goes on afterwards. So it's a matter of improving learning. That's really the goal of formative assessment. And that is juxtaposed with the term summative assessment. And summative assessment is what you would call assessment of learning. It happens at the end. So one kind of summative assessment would be if there is a final examination at the end of a course that you get your grade on. That's summative, because after you do that exam, you know you're done with the material. You never read it or look at it again, right? That's what the students will tell you. I'm being facetious there. I hope that you will think about it again, but most students don't. I finished that semester, I'm done, I took my test, my summative test, I have my grade, my mark, I'm done. Also, summative assessment is the assessment that's done often by education authorities of students in the United States. It's at the end of every school year, every grade, from grade 2, that is 7 years old, through upper elementary, upper primary, you would call it. In Hong Kong, I understand there is an assessment that is given at the end of primary, by which many schools are judged. And in different countries, it's different places, but summative assessments may be given by the government, or they may be given by researchers for the purpose of things like international benchmarking and comparison, where they're looking at science and mathematics skills in different countries. Those two are assessments of past learning rather than assessments for learning. Reliability and validity. I'm sure these are familiar terms to you, but I'm introducing them because they're going to be important as our discussion unfolds. So reliability is having a measure that you get from your assessment that is consistent, so that you can show that in the absence of some kind of change, if you just redo the assessment, the same student will get the same result on the assessment. So it's not a matter of just random chance like flipping a coin. You really are getting a consistent measurement. Or the example I like to use is the scale I have to measure my weight in the bathroom. If I get on it and I read my weight and I step off it, and sometimes I don't like the weight, so I get on it again. If it says the same thing or pretty much the same thing all 3 times, it's reliable. I may not like it, but it's a reliable measure. Now, I used to have a scale that gave me quite different weights all 3 times. So that was not a very reliable measure, and I finally decided I had to get rid of my scale and buy a new one because I was only kidding myself. So that's reliability. It's a consistent measure. Or if you're using something like rubrics, many teachers use them in the class. And if you're using it particularly for important purposes, then it's necessary that if teacher A judges these 5 students on the rubric and comes up with certain decisions, or teacher B does the same thing, those decisions, the judgments should be similar across the different graders. So that's part of reliability. Now, validity is, does the assessment really measure what you think you're measuring? So sometimes we think we're measuring For example, we think we're measuring science knowledge, conceptual knowledge, when we give an assessment, a summative assessment. But in some cases, if you look more closely, depending on the nature of the assessment, it may be that we're really measuring reading comprehension in the language of the assessment. So we have some students taking the assessment and it's not in their mother tongue. And it turns out that we could just as easily have given a reading test. We would have gotten the very same scores we get on what we think is a science assessment, but we're really measuring reading comprehension. Now there's something about validity that's important to remember. It's not something that adheres in the test. And you hear people misuse this concept a lot. They say this is a valid test. You can't say that. You cannot say this is a valid test. Validity does not adhere in the test. Validity is dependent on the way in which you're using the measures. So it depends what you're using the measure for. And there needs to be evidence that the measures you get out of your assessment are valid in the context and for the purpose you're using them. And so it's a much more difficult challenge than many people realize, and that's going to be a challenge for our technology-based assessments too. I'm going to argue that that's one of the biggest challenges we're going to have to face. The other point I wanted to make is that although if you set out to design assessments for different purposes, formative or summative purposes, you would no doubt design them in different ways. But actually, the formative quality really is something that has to be judged by the context as well. You have to look at how the assessment was used to decide whether it's really being used to further learning or it's really used at the end of instruction to make a decision about what was learned in the past. Okay. High stakes assessment. We use that term in the United States. I don't know if it's common other places. I heard people in Hong Kong call it high risk assessment, which maybe is a better way of saying it. So this is an assessment where, depending on the outcome, somebody stands to suffer if the outcome is not favorable. So if a student taking this assessment might not get into the secondary school of their choice because of what happens on the examination, or if they might not qualify to go to university, that's a high stakes or a high risk assessment. If in the United States, if the students in a school do not get good marks on the examinations given by the state at the end of the year, the school, in fact, can have all of its staff fired in some jurisdictions. So you could lose your job if you are a teacher in those schools. Well, that's a high-risk assessment, I think you would agree, under that kind of system. So when you have a high stakes or a high-risk assessment, particularly validity and reliability better be unimpeachable. They better be very, very high. Otherwise, you're in danger of really doing harm. And then finally, the term dropping from the sky assessment. Has anybody heard that before? Dropping from the sky? Okay. My colleague Jim Pellegrino at University of Illinois likes to use that term. And it really applies to summative assessments that are part of, in many cases, accountability systems, state systems. So the idea is that it doesn't necessarily have much to do with what you've been learning from the classroom. We've been learning whatever we have in primary school, and all of a sudden it's the first week in May in the United States, and the students will spend 5 days taking these examinations that come from the state. And it may be material they've been learning, and it may not. It may look similar to the materials they have in their classroom, and it may not. So those are dropping from the sky examinations. So it's kind of it's the opposite of a formative assessment. It's kind of a pejorative term for a summative assessment.